Are your Dungeons & Dragons characters dogged adventurers and gritty monster hunters?
Can they barely survive the dangers of a deadly dungeon?
Or are they glorious champions who lead entire armies to battle?
Or are they mighty enough to challenge the gods themselves?
Greetings, Dungeon Masters. My name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Now, Dungeons & Dragons characters grow in power as they gain levels, and their adventures must change in scope and scale to suit.
Dungeons & Dragons is broken into 4 tiers of play that we're going to be talking about today. They average about 5 levels per tier, and they're broken into levels 1 to 4, 5 to 10, 11 to 16, and 17 to 20.
Today, we're going to go through each of these 4 tiers of play and discuss the powers and abilities that characters possess within each one, as well as the types of monsters that are found within each tier. And we're going to reference those with examples from video games, books, movies, and television shows to help you see exactly how Dungeons & Dragons characters evolve over the course of an entire level 1 to 20 campaign. This is an extremely useful framework that you can use as a dungeon master to create quests, organize your campaign, and build appropriate challenges for your characters. And understanding this system is one of the keys to unlocking the great narrative strengths of the Dungeons & Dragons game. With that,
let's get rolling. Let's start with tier 1, which we're going to call the local heroes.
Or the adventurer tier.
Yeah. So what does that look like?
Well, this tier starts at 1st level, and it goes as high as 4th level, although some people might cut it off at 5th as well.
Yeah. Now, this is the grittier side of D&D. This is where your characters are not very powerful. They're dealing with very real-world issues, and they're very, very mortal.
Indeed. You are probably not surprised at how easy it is after your first adventure for a level 1 character to get dropped by a goblin. And this is a theme that continues throughout the this first tier of play. Low-level characters can get taken out in a single hit. They don't have a lot of endurance. And they really feel like normal human beings, but just very talented ones that tend to have a couple unique abilities.
Yeah.
Right?
Now, one thing that I always think of is, we've talked a lot about this, is even at tier 1, you don't want to think of your characters as average humans. They're still heroes. They do stand out amongst the general public, but they're standing out in the way of, like, they are slightly above average.
Yeah.
And they're known for being slightly above average.
Yeah, they might be the equivalent of like an Olympic athlete or an elite soldier, or kind of really any kind of eminent individual that you can think of from real world history was still a low level character. Nobody in the real world has ever been higher than probably level 3 or 4 in D&D terms, right? And that follows through in a lot of our most popular forms of media, right? I think if you look at a world like Game of Thrones, there is not a single character in that story that could definitively be said to have abilities that are higher than a 4th level character.
And if you want to look at the setting of Game of Thrones, nowhere in that show are the heroes dealing with like Tarrasques or large scale monsters. The largest scale monster that they have is a dragon, which is extremely intimidating in their world, because a dragon to a bunch of level 4 characters
You're screwed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in their world, that is the be all end all of power in terms of strategic play and all
if
of
you
that,
look at magic at low level play, it very much suits a low magic world, right? People might be able to occasionally turn invisible or throw a bolt of fire or make a small illusion, but the really spectacular magical effects don't appear in tier 1 at all. Right? There's no fireballs here. There's no teleportation. There ain't any coming back from the dead.
There's a little bit of coming back.
There's
from
a
the dead,
little
but
bit.
That would be probably the highest
Yeah.
level magic users in the game, because it's not something that they're just like, oh, we can raise them from the dead. It's a very rare thing mentioned in the show.
Exactly, and it tends to be a thing that when these great, powerful abilities come into play in stories that are around grittier characters, they tend to involve supernatural forces and exceptional circumstances. It's not like every day you get them traveling through time or bringing someone back to life. It's a special and significant moment. And so I find that if you're the type of DM that loves low magic settings, you love low level adventures that are really gritty, that there's a lot of risk of death, you're going to love tier 1 play. There's not a lot of magic items to go around. You usually find consumables. And the players in general have to feel very mortal.
There is always that moment for me when we finish a campaign and then we start a new one. And I get that little moment of shock where I'm like, what do you mean I have 9 hit points? That doesn't seem reasonable, but at this tier of play, that is what you're working with.
Yeah, so you're going to be battling against local bandits, a thieves guild. You might get embroiled in local politics, take out a nest of goblins, right? Tier 1 characters are going to be really on edge when they encounter things like giants and dragons. It can happen, but those are going to be like the boss monsters that they encounter.
Yeah.
Right? A fight against a troll is very scary for low-level characters, right? If 2 ogres show up, 3 ogres show up, you're probably going to run away, right?
Why don't we move on to tier 2, which is we've done local heroes. Now we're doing heroes of the realm. Yeah, so that's a little wider of a scope.
Yeah, and the heroes of the realm is often sometimes called the heroic tier. And it really represents that super classic swords and sorcery, high fantasy archetype. Because at this point in character advancement, a lot of the magical abilities that define the fantasy genre begin to appear, and much more regularly than they did before.
I would say it's one of the most noticeable tier changes is when you hit level 5. If you ask anybody that's played D&D for a little while, hitting level 5, you always feel like, oh, there's my abilities.
Yes.
There's all my stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where it really comes into play, and your characters really do feel like they've just jumped up in power.
Yeah, and you can now take a couple hits, you can use your abilities regularly, and we start to see magical powers like fireballs and lightning bolts are a regular occurrence in most battles. You tend to see characters being part of armies or taking on legions of enemies, right? Whereas before they really couldn't. And now, if they get matched up against a pair of giants, it's not necessarily a situation where they might run away, but that's going to be a difficult battle.
Yeah, that's still a top end battle, but it's one that they look at now and they say, maybe we can take this.
Yeah, we also start to see magic items become a much bigger part. A lot of heroic characters have their iconic magical weapon, or a magical item of some kind. Usually, still with the heroic tier, nothing of a legendary power.
Yeah.
It tends to be like subtle magic, but still common.
Now, an important note about this tier of play: the characters are still mortal. Yeah. And they still feel very mortal. Death is extremely real at this tier of play, and you shouldn't start running in thinking that you can handle anything.
Yeah, towards the end of this tier, coming back from the dead is something that can happen, and you see it a lot in stories. You also see much more long-distance travel. Perhaps the characters might take a portal, or they might venture into the Feywild or the Shadowfell very briefly, right, for a specific purpose. And I think you really see this quite clearly in something like The Lord of the Rings, right? Where we see the heroes of The Lord of the Rings are extremely competent, aside from the hobbits, who are kind of still left behind, a tier below.
Yeah.
But they can fight ogres, they can fight monsters, and legions of orcs, right? And you still get that kind of instances of characters that are coming back from the dead or surviving terrible wounds, right?
Yeah. Most of the heroes in Lord of the Rings are in this tier. I always think it's funny because I always say that Frodo's a level 1 character who everybody just gave magic items to.
Yep.
And that's why he's so powerful.
And Aragorn really isn't like
Aragorn's like level
5,
maybe?
5 or 6. And Gandalf is really hard to stat because he really is an angel and has added supernatural abilities. And that's where I think people run into trouble with fiction, is that often a character like Gandalf has abilities that are beyond the tier that the story exists in.
Yeah.
Right? That's okay. But D&D actually allows you to do that. Like, if you want to give your characters the ability to become ethereal or summon an undead army,
Yeah.
you know, you can go ahead and do that once, but that undead army is only showing up for one battle, and it's probably not going to be the final battle.
What's really cool about Lord of the Rings is you see them face a lot of really intense monsters. Oftentimes they end up running away.
Yeah.
Like with the Balrog, or I'm forgetting the name of it, but that creature outside the Mines of Moria.
Yeah, the Watcher in the Darkness.
Yeah, but they still face them, they still battle them, they still have an encounter with them and survive to tell about it.
Yeah.
Which is important, is you're getting a little bit more of that magic. It's still a gritty tier.
It is.
But with more magic, with more abilities and more survivability.
Yeah, and that's why this tier is often called the sweet spot of D&D. It's well regarded that the adventures that occur between 5th and 10th level often have this awesome mix of durable, action-packed characters and the ability of the dungeon master to involve much higher level threats that the players can kind of tangle with for a moment and then realize they're in over their heads and run away. And you haven't yet started to see the truly world-shaking magic that comes from the higher level tiers because the characters feel so mortal, right? I think other great examples of stories that occur at this tier would be like the Dresden Files for more modern fantasy. Again, magic is very reliable. It's a thing that works, but people can still travel around a lot. If you've played any video games like Skyrim or Dragon Age, straight up heroic tier adventures. I would even add to that like games like the Witcher series or the Witcher books. And to even step again with that, heroes of a certain level that are caught beyond their capability, Guardians of the Galaxy is a great example of a group of characters that they don't really have any amazing high level powers. They're all very competent, arguably. They have interesting abilities.
Yeah.
And then they get thrust in over their heads in a situation that is far beyond, that they have to really rely on their wits and their allies to survive.
Yeah.
And I love that as a theme of the heroic tier, where the characters face these bigger threats than they can fight head on, and so they have to grab allies and friends to help them take that threat on.
We're now going to take a look at tier 3, which moves from heroes of the realm to masters of the realm.
These truly are powerful characters at this point.
Yeah.
These high-level characters, once a D&D character reaches level 11, I consider them to be a living legend.
Yeah, at this point, if they're not well known in the world, they should be, because legends will be written about these characters. They're performing feats that are far beyond the capabilities of a normal mortal human.
Yeah, at this point, in fact, D&D characters have developed superhuman levels of resilience. And this is why it's often very hard to roleplay them, and also for a dungeon master to describe the action, because at this point, the characters are suffering attacks and abilities that a regular human being simply could not survive.
At this point, they can face like a giant or ogre onslaught.
Yeah.
And stand up to
battle an army of giants.
Yeah.
Right? I'm thinking of like that scene from the beginning of Thor, where they go in and fight tons of giants, right? Or even the Avengers themselves and the climax of the first Avengers movie, where now you've got characters of such great power and they can battle incredibly dangerous monsters, but also in large numbers.
And the Avengers is a great one to go to, because in the Avengers you have something that's threatening the world.
Yeah.
And the world cannot deal with it, so they have to call upon this group of individuals who are far superior to any other human that they know, and say, you guys need to take care of this because we can't.
Yeah. Especially in D&D at this tier, things like resurrection magic, teleportation over vast distances become regular occurrences. Characters are taking to the air in battle sometimes of their own volition, and they possess extremely powerful magic items. So your typical battle is like the scene from a high fantasy action movie or superhero show. And embracing that with this tier is what makes it really, really exciting.
Yeah, one thing that I've noticed DMing this tier is you don't really get a lot out of just throwing mundane creatures at them anymore.
It doesn't work anymore. You can't expect to put basic melee fighting enemies up against tier 3 characters and expect that to be a satisfying combat encounter. They will just wreck it.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. And that's what makes this so difficult for a dungeon master, is that now you really need to open up your monster manual, go in and find those interesting creatures. And sometimes I think, you ask yourself this question of like, that's a cool monster. What if there were 2 of them? Right? And sometimes that's all it takes, right? You might look at a really awesome monster that is like in the challenge rating 11 to 15 area, like a adult dragon. And one adult dragon, the 11th level characters can definitely make mincemeat out of them. 2 adult dragons, that's a different story entirely.
That becomes very scary. Even right? I use the minion rule a lot in this tier, where like if you throw in that big creature, in the previous tiers, you throw in a big creature and you have a one-on-one, like the party versus that one monster. It's a bad place to be. But in this tier, if you're throwing in a big monster, you might want to throw in a few little creatures as well to kind of aid in that, to make it just seem more dire.
Yeah.
Another thing that I really like that you do quite often is you'll involve some sort of environmental hazard or something to like just up the scale of that battle just a little bit more.
I think actually by this tier, you kind of need to stop looking at regular battlefields, and probably your campaign's worn out of them. It's time to go to other worlds, right? Like, let's go to the elemental plane of fire. Let's go to the heart of a volcano, right? Let's go thousands of miles in the air in the middle of a primal hurricane filled with lightning bolts. Let's force the characters to battle deep in the depths underwater, right? You really kind of have the invitation now to go over the top with your imagination. And just with every single thing, it's like, light it on fire, or its body's charged with electricity, or now you're in space, right? It's kind of that, you now need to take the normal ideas that you would have and add one more sentence to the end of them to really take them over the top. It gets really difficult because of this to have a serious campaign at this stage. But it can be successfully done by increasing the stakes, right? When the world is at stake, no one's going to question the fact that that's a giant lightning shooting fish flying through the sky. They're going to be like, oh man, we got to stop it from destroying the entire city.
Yeah.
Right?
Which I think it's important to note that talking about the previous tiers, if we look at the first tier, they're fighting on a local scale.
Yeah.
When you move on to the next tier, maybe it's the whole realm, like we talked about, but it's something more impacting the realm at a very human level, a very natural level. By the time they reach this third tier, we're talking about world-ending disasters.
Yep. And that's where we go to tier 4, the absolute masters of the world. And these characters aren't just saving the world, they might be fighting for the very foundations of existence itself.
By the time your characters reach this level, we're talking about battles with gods. We're talking about just shifting in and out of different universes at this point, and like doing the craziest things that you could ever imagine.
A Dungeons and Dragons character that is over level 17 is effectively a mythological demigod. We want to draw inspiration for these adventures in the battles of, the Aesir and the Vanir from Norse mythology, or the conflicts of the Greek gods of Olympus versus the Titans, right? These primal conflicts that define the fundamental order of the universe are the things that characters of this epic power must deal with. And because Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition does not have epic levels, really the 17th to 20th level characters now are the ones that take up that mantle, right?
Yeah.
And straight up, it's really difficult to deal with. You've now got characters who can wish the world to obey them. They can clone themselves. They can make copies of themselves. They can come back from the dead in the blink of an eye. They can regenerate from almost any form of damage launched at them. And not only that, they can summon meteors and destroy entire cities with earthquakes and tsunamis. Their power is world-shattering.
I think one of the really cool examples that we talked about is in the previous tier we discussed the Avengers.
Yeah.
In this tier we had talked about Superman.
Yeah.
Being of this tier of play. And the idea here is Captain America is an Avenger, but you put him in the same room as Superman, and the things that they have to deal with are vastly different.
Yeah. You know, if Captain America has to deal with a meteor coming to destroy the Earth, he's got to form a team, he's got to get all these people to help him and launch a spaceship. Superman's just going to fly and punch that meteor out, right? And that's the difference in the scope and scale of these high-level characters in terms of the way that they can approach problems and solutions that makes it such a challenge to deal with these high levels of character power. But it's something that I think that as a DM you need to embrace. I've talked to Dungeon Masters. A really common thing is like Dungeon Masters go, well, falling damage in 5th edition caps out at 20 d6, which if you look at that, that's like an average of 70 damage, which is not going to kill a 20th level character, right? So people will then change the rules and say, you know, if you fall from over 500 feet, you die instantly. Well, you know, if you took Jaime Lannister and knocked him off a 500-foot drop, I totally expect him to die.
Yeah, but we're talking tier 1 to 4.
Yeah,
there.
but if you throw Aragorn off that, maybe not. He did survive a pretty big fall.
Yeah.
Right? If you throw Captain America off a 500-foot drop,
you're
absolutely
probably betting.
not.
Yeah, you're betting on him surviving.
And Superman doesn't even flinch when he gets thrown through multiple skyscrapers.
Yeah, he can go like 1,000 feet through all of these horrible things, and then he stands back up and he's like, "Oh, that hurt."
You could throw Superman into the sun and he would survive.
He might be more powerful.
Yeah. Actually, that might be a bad idea. So, like, you don't need to make the rules bend over backwards to accommodate this. In fact, like, looking at how to deal with this as a DM is understanding how the tiers of play change the tone and genre of a Dungeons and Dragons campaign. And you either need to embrace it or recognize that it's not to your taste and avoid it.
Yeah, I see a lot of people talk about this whole idea of how do I keep my campaign setting low and gritty? What happens when they reach these higher levels? The idea here is don't let them reach those higher levels. Perhaps you want to cap out your campaign at 6th level if you want like a Game of Thrones type setting.
Yeah, and just straight up, like you go through the monster manual and say, my campaign setting doesn't have any of these monsters that are over CR20. There's nobody in my world that can cast a 5th level spell. And there you go. And if you are open with your players about that and set that as an expectation, that can be a really exciting campaign. And what you could then do is if you still want to have that a long-lasting campaign, you can either slow down the rate of XP gain, or you can let characters that have hit whatever level cap you've added get feats or other abilities. Maybe they can take a feat to learn like a 4th level spell, right? At the same time, maybe you completely hate the grittiness of low-level play, right? Yeah. And you love super heroic action. Start your campaigns at 11th level. If you're like, if you can't wait to have that kind of action happening in your campaign and you find low-level play boring because it's always the same thing to you, don't play it. Just skip over it and have people create characters that are already at a higher level and already have that history behind them. The other thing that I want to note about tone, right, is like maybe you are absolutely in love with the horror genre, right?
I am.
I don't think horror and Superman kind of
doesn't really
oil and vinegar, right?
Yeah.
Like they don't really match. So like if you love themes of horror, then you might find that high-level D&D doesn't work for that, right? So there's certain different genre things, like a war-based campaign works really, really well in the heroic tier because the characters aren't so powerful that they can just destroy that entire army, right? So it's really important to gauge, like, what's the story you want to tell and match that to the power level of the characters and the monsters they're going to be facing. Now, if you don't want to limit your campaign, if you still want to play a full level 1 to 20 campaign, I think it's important to embrace the change and recognize the opportunities that it presents for you as a DM to bring a breath of fresh air into your campaign as it's going along.
Yeah.
I think one of the things in our current campaign, we went from the first tier to the second tier, and there was a really dramatic shift in tone, but it reinvigorated the characters and the campaign setting.
I think what was amazing about that, having just played through it, when we did our level 1 to 5 arc, it was extremely lighthearted. It was fun. Nothing was really overly scary, which we actually were playing this very fun version of D&D that involved like
tavern games and drinking.
Yeah, and we had like a rogue assassins guild that we were dealing with who were kind of jerks, but that was the worst of our problems.
And petty rivalries.
Yeah.
Right?
Then all of a sudden that tier finished, and we had a conclusion to that tier that tied itself in directly to the next tier, which suddenly upped the scale to a war-themed campaign setting very, very naturally.
Yeah, and when that happens, the characters get this opportunity to develop, right? Like your character, Kalik, the monk, was very cocky, very arrogant, but also took life not very seriously. And I remember that moment when your character met up with your character's father again, and the reaction from your character's family was, well, war has made a man out of you.
And it had. Right? My character had to change a lot of what I had written about who he was as a person, changed when suddenly he was thrown into having to go to war.
Yeah.
And that really changed his outlook.
Yeah, I'll be really interested to see how that character changes over the course of the future of the campaign, because we want to take this one all the way to level 20 and see where that goes. For me as a DM, it's also great because I find that a really easy trap to fall into as a DM is thinking that like you have to imagine your entire campaign as one complete movie. But like the Lord of the Rings is not a level 1 to 20 campaign. It's a campaign where the characters went from maybe level 5 to level 7 and wrapped the whole thing up, right? And we only saw that one piece of it. So if you make a campaign where you introduce the Dark Lord of Death and Destruction at level 1, but your intent is to not have the players fight the Dark Lord of Death and Destruction till level 20, well, 3 years later, by the time they actually get to that fight, they could be so bored of that character that the villain looks like a joke, because it's like, you haven't killed us until now?
Yeah, I mean,
right?
if you have a character that's a villain that's that powerful, why doesn't he just show up and he's like, oh, you guys are causing a problem?
Yeah. So I like to think of like each tier of play as a season of the television series that is my campaign, right? And so I find it's really valuable to say, well, I'm going to have a different villain in each tier. You might want to invent like a sprawling conspiracy between those tiers that links things together. But sometimes it's just enough to have the same characters in the same settings, and that's all the link you need.
Well, I'll actually use an example from one of the pre-made modules here. I'm just finishing up running Rise of Tiamat after running Horde of the Dragon Queen.
Yeah.
And what I really liked about that is at the beginning arc of the story, you hear about one of the worm speakers, and you're like, oh man, this is a threat. And you spend the first tier and a half trying to track down, actually it might be the first 2 tiers, trying to track down one villain. Upon finding and defeating that villain, you then find out that she was one of several. She was one of 5. And now suddenly the tier shifts and you're like, oh, there are 4 more of these people that I need to track down. Which I thought was actually a nice little buildup of, here you have one villain that really seems like the prominent villain in the campaign, and then it opens up to say that was just a pawn in the grand scheme of things.
And I think that that's a really common storytelling trope, and I would never be ashamed of using it, right? And also that can be a really cool way of like escalating the story too. It's like, you thought that one villain was deadly, but now there are 5, right? And it's a great way to give new life to an existing campaign as you move between tiers. And when you really get up there to the very end of it, you really want to start thinking about what the final destiny of these characters are, and increasingly let them make an impact on your world. I'm of a very strong belief that a D&D campaign should alter the campaign setting in which it occurs in. And as you get up to those higher tiers, your world is going to get set on fire, right? Things are going to be world shaking, and it will never be the same again. And sometimes the most awesome and satisfying thing is for high-level, demigod-like D&D characters to face that world-shattering danger, and then to see the new first-level characters in the next campaign get to live in that new world that was created as a result.
So this has been our guide to the tiers of play in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition.
And whether your characters are gritty adventurers or bold demigods, we'd love to hear about them in the comments below.
Now, a lot of this had to do with different types of combat that you might encounter. So we have a guide to running combat right up over here.
Character death is inevitable in almost any tier of play, so you can hear our thoughts on that right over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
in the dungeon.